The production of this video was made possible by donors to the Orchestration Online Patreon initiative. Please consider adding your support to the creation of free educational internet resources by visiting our Patreon page linked below. Hey there, this is your orchestration tutor, Thomas Goss, bringing you the next part of the massive introduction of Berlioz's first movement of the Symphonie Fantastique. We left off with Berlioz having stated and then restated a melody that he composed when he was 11, which is just this yearning boyhood crush. There's so much youthful pathos in it, and I wonder, to a degree, whether or not Berlioz was kidding himself. He kind of tended to do that. Even in his autobiography, you kind of get the sense that there's a part of him that is enjoying the spectacle of going through his own dirty laundry and realizes that he really does go a little too far a lot of the time. So I think that there's a quality of that, just a hint of that in the beginning, where the artist is discovering his own ability to become obsessed and forlorn and everything else. Disappointed in love, he reaches out for something new to be fixated upon, more or less. But there's a certain coolness to the entire thing, isn't there? And here at F, finally the music starts to warm up. These low A flats turn into the bottom note of an implied D flat 6/4 chord. We can see that here. These are essentially D flat fifths in transposing from our B flat instrument here, of the clarinets. And of course D flat thirds above in the flutes. A very simple voicing, really. You have your, it's like a horn voicing, really, when you think about it. Fifths below, then the octave is the lower note of the upper third. But I just really love how Berlioz, not really using an enormous amount of calculation, just manages to warm up the page. Almost like the dawn breaking over the initial long night of agony, childish agony as it might seem, literally. Taken from a song that he wrote when he was mooning after a village sweetheart who was actually, I think, about 6 or 7 years older than him and out of reach. Little rising figures in the second violins. That's beautiful. And almost like little bird song here in the first violins. It's just so imaginative. All these little touches, and they don't really necessarily mean a whole lot on their own, or there are not that many of them, but they add up, right? So with this long drone here of the low A flat, and the harmony is going to reinterpret what that root could possibly mean. So in this case, it essentially becomes an enharmonic G sharp, correct? If you look at the way this is all scored out. This is also a romantic standard that was developed, I think, first by Beethoven. There are a couple of pieces in which he has a long, low pedal like this and then reinterprets the harmony over it. But it's Berlioz, once again, that makes it seem like his own because he makes the scope so important. He really focuses on the effect as much as the result. In Beethoven's case, he'll come up with a new effect, a new trademark, a new approach as a means to some other end. But in Berlioz, Berlioz takes that effect and he makes it the important part. This rising little figure in the violas. So wonderful. And the floating triplets above. This is all basically providing a frame to the first horn solo. Once again, we are reading in E flat, so this is A flat below. So the 5 of D flat major, and just sort of walks down here. All of these notes here are easily playable by a natural horn. Now here when we get to this A, remember what I said about half stopping a G and then getting a whole step above? So that's what the player would be doing here. So once again, you would need a really good player, your first player. That would be the person you would trust to do that half stopping on a G. You wouldn't necessarily just say any player back in that day. And here we have a quasi-trill by the third, giving the higher player prominence, more trustworthy. I think this C sharp here might be stopped, so it makes sense that it is going to pianissimo here. So it doesn't call attention to itself. You'll see that in scoring sometimes of this period and earlier, that a stop note will be marked pianissimo, or the music will sort of be finagled so that the horn stop notes are at a soft place in the music. So the audience isn't saying, hey, what is that? The horns got really weird all of a sudden. Even though an audience would have been used to the horns having kind of a strange sound when they went to stop notes, you still didn't want to call attention to that all the time. So there are a few other spots that I could point out in other scores. Here, this is all perfectly possible. In fact, B flat is part of the harmonic series. It's slightly out of tune, but the player will correct it with their lip. So bum bum ba bum bum ba bum bum ba bum. Just so beautifully done with the third on this E going back and forth. Now the music is starting to open out here. We have more of that bum bum ba bum kind of idea. This time, notice that this is F sounding A flat, the same pitch as this. And here we have B sounding an octave lower in the C horn. It's fascinating to me to look at a score like this, just right on the crux. Within a generation, the valve horn would be fairly common or just starting to be used, but here there are a lot of compensations. All right, moving on. I really love this chord right in here with everybody. I'll pick it apart in a second. Once again, this is scoring that is opening the gate for modern orchestration, as much as it is something that you might see in a page of Weber or something that owes a bit to orchestration you see in Beethoven and Schubert and so on. Not that Berlioz would have known that much about Schubert's orchestration as of yet. Right in here, remember how we had the C horns enclosing the E flat horns. Now here this is reversed. These are Gs, think down a major sixth, so down a major sixth from E is G. So these are G octaves, and then this is sounding down an octave. So essentially what you're seeing here is a big, beautiful octave C major 6/4 chord. And that's really what is going on here. It's just a big 6/4 chord in C major. And of course it's going to end up changing to a 5/7 chord, right? Because we are setting up a cadence to go to C, which is anything but obvious, but we'll talk about that in a minute. All right, so the music has been cresting towards this. We had this change to an A natural finally, which is lovely. And I really love the length of the pedal. It's starting to push at what people would have felt possible or tasteful back in the day. And then this crescendo poco a poco of these triplets. So we end up here, and a lot of this stuff is really what we would think of as textbook today, but not necessarily back then. This E6th right in here is being doubled by the oboes, right? And this nice, lovely, unmeasured tremolo. And then we've got these thirds, and they're not the same as these, right? But they're complementary. The C thirds are sharing the E with these E thirds. Below, the violas are playing a G sixth, a fairly simple double stop for them to play, with the top note landing on the same E that the second violins are playing. Here, the clarinets are going to be sharing the E with the oboe, which themselves are doubling the same E sixth as the second violins. And then you have this little G fourth below in the bassoons, and that's supplying the root in the middle, and the top of this G octave doubling with the cellos. And then, of course, we saw that this was a big 6/4 chord right in the middle, G octaves with the C thirds in the middle. And, of course, that is the bottom two pitches. This sounding G and this sounding middle C are going to be doubling the bassoons. I've taken apart one or two Berlioz chords before in some of my lectures. Check out my Tutti chords videos if you want to take another look at that. This lift up an octave. So great. Really emphasizing the sense of lift right in here. So mezzo forte, diminuendo, crescendo to fortissimo. It's such a wonderfully romantic gesture. It's almost like the dawning of the Romantic era is happening right in this chord progression here. So, as I said before, we're going to a 5/7 chord here, and I'm not going to bother taking it apart. Now that I've given you some of the basics, you can do that yourself. But just ending with this lovely C major chord, triple P, another kind of romantic thing to mark triple P rather than just pianissimo. So, once again, just taking everything a little bit farther. And the answering, the call and response, back and forth, pizzicato and a short, more or less staccato wins. And that is all just setting up this. Notice the coming cut time signature. This big slamming chord. Now I'm going to take apart one more chord, so if everybody out there whose score reading skills are really, really great, please bear with me, because I'm going to talk a little bit about the implications of where the force is in the chord. I would say the scoring of this chord is really reminiscent to me of everything from Mozart's Don Giovanni forward to Beethoven's Ninth and Beethoven's Seventh, and other kind of big works of orchestration that Berlioz would have been familiar with. By the way, he was, I feel, very influenced by the Ninth Symphony of Beethoven, but not necessarily a big fan of the choral movement, right? So like the chorale movement is really what we think of today as being the greatest part of that symphony, but Berlioz had extreme reservations about the quality of the choral writing in the choral symphony. So we've got this big fat thump here on the timpani. And notice that the basses are up. The double basses are playing written middle Cs, so that would be C in the staff for the cellos. And the cellos are playing middle Cs, the actual sounding middle Cs. And they're being enclosed by the violas. And this is a really great way of scoring this, because the cellos can put as much force as they want to just into one single note. And so can the violas, because this is one of the easiest double stops you could possibly imagine. Right? So they get the force of that second string, and then the third string is a fingered G. Right? So that just all just hits like a hammer blow. And then octaves are very simple to play for violinists, especially up higher. And then you've got the C thirds, also a pretty simple double stop. All right, so I think these are all intended to be double stops. Double chord, as they might write in another part of this score. Once again, we've got the flutes taking another step higher in the chord by themselves. So the high E is being played without any help from the violins. But it's inherent, of course, in the overtones from this E and the seconds. Then the C is being doubled by first oboe, and then there is no G being played by the violins, by the upper strings. That is being covered by the clarinets Now, in a case like this, it's really the root and the third of the chord that is important. The fifth is just implied and will come through in the overtones a lot of the time. This is something that I'm sure Berlioz had observed for himself because it's all over his writing. He'll soft pedal the dominant in chords like this a lot. And then we've got this root C right in here, written D, actually sounding C. That's being played by both groups of violins. Then the G octaves are being doubled by the violas. Pretty simple. Then our C right in here is sounding middle C. That's the same as this note here. And of course, the E is showing up in between the violas and double basses, and of course inside the bassoon octaves. And the bassoons are just doubling what's going on in the lower strings. So it's an extremely forceful chord because everybody is playing right in the strongest part of their registers. And it's also a place where all the instruments have the most comfortable control, right? There aren't any rock bottom or extra high bassoon notes. It isn't in the throat tones of the clarinet. It isn't too high for the oboes. So it's just a beautifully orchestrated chord. Ba-ba, ba, bum. And then same thing, da-da. So very cool. So here the composer is asking for firmer sticks rather than felt sticks. He wants wooden sticks that are covered a little. I think that have a bit of felt or some other cover on top of them. Then he's basically setting up the idée fixe, the obsessive idea. And here we've got these two little upbeat notes going into it. So just remember these notes when we look at the following section of this lecture. Remember all of this stuff, okay? The way that I pulled apart this chord and just the intensity of it, with every single instrument being not only beautifully balanced, but in their strongest place for that particular chord. Also think a little bit about the sudden leaping forwards of the tempo, right? We're finally getting to a fast tempo rather than the big, luxurious, slow introduction. Romantic composers took this as permission to follow up the Symphonie Fantastique eventually, not right away, but eventually with very long intros of their own before they really got to the main themes. Or they might hint at the main themes in their long, luxurious intros, and then eventually hit us with the big, fast introduction of the theme, which is what Berlioz does here. Keeping in mind, though, that really Beethoven opened the door on this somewhat with some of his symphonies, and his symphonies were based on some older models that had slower introductions as well. There's some in Haydn and so on. So it's not necessarily a new idea, but as I'm probably going to repeat about 100 times before the end of this lecture series, it's a question of scope. The scope of the innovation is what makes it feel like it's new, rather than it being something that they invented themselves. Listen for the quality of this chord, the sudden leaping forward of the speed, and then in these previous pages, the perfection of this chord, mezzo forte. It feels like forte just because everything is so nice and strong, but then pushing forwards to a real fortissimo, followed by triple P, which is, by the way, sort of a subito dynamic, but you'll find that there's a bit of a lag time going into that beat, just a teeny bit of a hairpin. If you really make it absolutely subito, just a big cliff to fall off of, I think it's kind of corny, actually. And the force of the fortissimo tends to wash over the beat, right? So I don't think that you want that. So there can just be a little bit of pulling back rather than just falling off. Listen to the wonderful shape of the texture right in here with this low pedal tone at the bottom and all of the other instruments filling out the space in beautiful ways, sometimes subtle, sometimes pictorial, like these little bird calls, and somehow distant, these horn calls It's almost like heralding in the distance. Hey, we're about to have a symphony here. I know you've been waiting for one, but here comes the king. Eventually we'll be arriving with our main theme. And no less so on this page as well. It would be really instructive to listen to what happened first and then to see how this comes in, and then suddenly the entire attitude seems to change from the kind of darkness and self-important neurosis. When you are yearning for unrequited love as a little guy, I had crushes when I was younger, when I was very young. There is nothing that is so lonely and sad as that poor little guy in the corner yearning for the companionship of somebody who has absolutely zero idea what you're feeling or even that you exist sometimes, right? So it's just something everybody feels. And Berlioz has captured it, I think, with beautiful seriousness, but just a slight touch of knowingness. He's not mocking himself, but there's a part of him that realizes that it is kind of a bit over the top, but he's going to indulge it for the listener. Back then, if you look at Winterreise and Die Schöne Müllerin, that kind of excessive inward-looking grief was a very common thing in classical scores, which you would think, well, that's more of a romantic thing, but encapsulated inside the end of the classical movement was that sort of self-pitying, self-indulgent kind of feeling in some of the music. Think about all those things and really the quality of the timbre. It is just so beautifully done with the low strings and the soft but radiant flutes and clarinets combined together. Notice that clarinets and flutes seem to be a natural companion in Berlioz's orchestration, especially on these first pages, rather than flute and oboe, which was considered to be the natural team-up in classical scoring. And this beautiful, casual, emotionally intelligent horn scoring right in here. That is like the perfect horn solo, especially for this kind of work. And then this lovely little faux trill right in here. Slow faux trill. So think about all those elements. Really listen to the different things as they go by. The leaping seconds, the rising violas, the birdsong of the violins, and the pulsing flutes and clarinets, and how they all add up to a wonderful accompaniment to the horn solos over this grounding A-flat pedal. And then I'll see you for the second half of this lecture, which is not going to be very long, but it's going to cover a lot of ground. Now we come to the famous idée fixe of the Symphonie Fantastique, and this melody is inspired by Harriet Smithson, who had taken Paris by storm and was staging Shakespeare in an extremely melodramatic kind of way, apparently with a bit of an Irish brogue, which a lot of English audience members could barely understand. So imagine the mystification of the French going to those performances night after night and just hanging on every word and trying to learn their Shakespeare in very ancient English. And yet they could not look away because she was so magnetic and so dramatic, and probably by our standards today would just really not make the grade at Stratford-on-Avon. But Back then, she was the hit of the season, and she kept coming back for more. So for several years, she was doing these wonderful performances in Paris and just bringing down the house. Imagine a Hamlet where the focus is on Ophelia. That was the power of her acting. Of course, I'm sure people appreciated the efforts of the other actor, but that was what you would get from one of those performances. Naturally, Berlioz fell in love, and this was the theme that he came up with to express his affection. The first violins and the first flute are playing in unison on this melody, and every part of the register works together beautifully because it's being played softly. Yeah, we've got poco sforzando. Notice that those happen when the flute is in the upper part of its register, but when it's in the lower part of its register, the music seems to be a little softer. Also notice the absence of a lot of firm dynamic marks, reminding you that this is piano or that's mezzo forte or whatever. It's left more up to the player. On the previous page, there were markings that let us know that absolutely we're going into a section where it's soft. That sets the dynamic. And then the players just play around the hairpins and are able to make something coherent, also following the lead of the conductor, which is very helpful. There isn't a whole lot to be said about this. It goes perilously low. However, if it's just a single flute and it's just the first violins, and they're not playing out too much, you can get a beautiful blend, and you can hear that in the recording that I'm going to use. And then, of course, reaching upwards, it's not hard at all for a single flute to blend adequately with a whole group of first violins. Dolce, a lot of emotion in some of these big pushes. Another thing that's worth mentioning is the little heartbeat in the background, right? This would be the character of Harriet Smithson coming out on stage, right? And then what's Berlioz's response? Thump, 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 thump. It's so simple, and it's so obvious, and it's so effective, and Berlioz manages to not make it sound corny because he really is sincere about it. Very simple scoring here, just D's and the second violins, G's, just basically playing a fifth right in there, and then you have the DG, DG, DG with the lower strings. Totally simple. All of this scoring, just so easy, like these double stops right in here. You have your open G and the E on top, and so on. So it's all really effective for all of that. Notice that the lower strings go to a combined staff, cellos and double basses. So this is something else that is worth mentioning, mainly because we're doing it now and we didn't do it before, and that is the independence of the double basses. This is, once again, something that Berlioz built on from the example provided by earlier composers, especially Beethoven, who freed up the double basses from having to always play the same thing as the cellos. And we've seen that before, like remember that pizzicato soli in the double basses in the first lecture. I felt that that was just a beautiful use of the double basses all on their own. And not necessarily daring, but certainly progressive for 1830, only about 3 years after Beethoven's death. Things start to speed up a little bit. Things start to get more intense, crescendo poco a poco. You think by the time you get to about right here, you would be sort of mezzo forte-ish in terms of force, reaching higher and higher. Up here, probably a nice committed forte by the time you get here. And you can see that the harmony is progressing right along with the theme in the lower strings. But the intervals are mainly keeping to very simple tuning that is easy to play as double stops. These accents, diminuendo to piano. This is almost mezzo staccato or portato in the way that it'll end up being played. And I've actually seen some players do all down bow and go up, 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 down. So it kind of turns into a portato. Of course, it's not really a portato because accent means to hit the beginning of the duration of the note hard and then let up a little, right? So that's not really the same thing. And I feel it shouldn't be played that way. So, da 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 da. Dun, da, 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 da. So if you really obey the exact dynamics here, this crescendo and then a further push right into that F sharp right in here. It just is so beautifully evocative. I would say that this whole idée fixe would be the perfect thing to study for people who are writing timid, boring first violin lines in their attempts to write symphonic music. Because there is so much beautiful variation, there is so much dynamic shape and nuance happening all over the place. That's what you want. And that kind of writing will force you to compose a different kind of theme, right? Because you can't just get away with really boring quarter notes and half notes that play over the basic scale that you're in, like the most common kind of early composing. You just really have to progress and find new modulations and find new chord progressions and find new meaning to the different notes of the scale. And very simple pizzicato from the double basses. Once again, their function splits off here, right? And then the cellos are part of this big chorale with just a little bit of pizzicato reaction from the double basses. And then things cool down to a big furious reaction. After the artist has been just sitting there awakening to the affection that he feels for the love of his life, how is he going to react? That will be the beginning of the next lecture. Here, however, as well as the perfection of the line, also consider the whole meaning of that term, idée fixe. So it's the fixed idea. That was something that lasted throughout the Romantic period, this whole idea of an idée fixe. For instance, I guess 65, 68 years later, would it be as much as 70 years later, Arthur Conan Doyle was using the term in one of his Sherlock Holmes stories called The Adventure of the Six Napoleons, where Dr. Watson suspects that the criminal might have what's called an idée fixe, which by that time had become known as a psychological term, not just an artistic term, but probably influenced by the story that's in Symphonie Fantastique of the obsessed lover, or the obsessed admirer, really, not a lover. The obsessed admirer is fixated so much on the object of his desire that it really is like a mental problem. So Watson wonders whether or not this person who's going around smashing up busts of Napoleon is crazy in that way, is fixated on Napoleon as somebody who might have wronged them in the past or wronged their ancestors, that they just want to destroy every image of them. But of course, Holmes scoffs at this. He's a man of reason. He's a prototypical 20th century skeptic. And he comes up with a solution which is something different. Really one of my favorite stories, but nothing to do with this except that it also uses that term, and it shows that it had a big influence over the Romantic period and over the burgeoning field of psychology, which developed a couple of generations later, which is in a way another kind of outcome of the Romantic period. The whole idea that you could cure somebody's mental problems. So I'm not saying that you can't, but I'm just saying that the idea that you could is a somewhat romantic kind of an idea. Listen for all of those things, the wonderful dynamic stresses, the quality of the string scoring. Berlioz's string scoring is so excellent, and I would say, yes, you should expect that to be the case. You shouldn't be surprised by it and think, well, Berlioz put together vast architectures of textures that we should admire and should appreciate for that sake. But I feel that naturally, in order to have a foundation for that upon which to build, you would absolutely have to have great string scoring, and that is evident throughout all of this symphony. And here's a great example of it. Not just that you are scoring in a way that the players can play well, but that you are scoring in a way that really expresses a musical idea with imagination and originality. And we're seeing that all over this. So listen for all of those things, and especially just how easy it is for the flute and the first violins to hold your attention, even though there's no accompaniment at all, right? Just the sudden loneliness and the sudden uniqueness of the melody, of its expression and its nuance, is so captivating that you don't need any accompaniment. And that is also underlining the character of the object of his affection, Harriet Smithson, just like he suddenly sees her alone on the stage, radiant in the darkness, probably as Ophelia. And he's just struck by her, thump, 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 his heart pounding in response. So that is all expressed musically here so perfectly. So have a listen to that. I hope you enjoy it. I hope that, especially if you are somebody who is still working on some of the basics of string section scoring, that you will pick up something useful from this in terms of its expressiveness and the way that it uses the registers of the violin. That wonderful middle register that can be so simple and effective without being over the top, and then just diving down a little bit and then reaching ever higher. And the same exact thing could also apply to the flute in a different context with its own particular strengths and weaknesses. Have fun with that, and I will see everybody in a couple of weeks. Thanks so much once again for supporting this. I'm so excited about this new lecture of Berlioz, and it's sort of forcing me to think differently because the music is structured so differently from the complex orchestrations that we've been studying for the past few years in these series.